hello. I love that song, don't you? Especially as it applies to our theme during the last 2 or 3 weeks, or several weeks. And we continue with that now and taking a look at the history of Lawrence. And we'll be back to do that with Steve Jansen, who is the director of the Watkins Museum here in Lawrence. So stay tuned. Welcome back. Our guest again, Steve Jansen from the Watkins Museum. And Steve, we've had a great time over the last several weeks pioneering, you might say, clear through into the Jet Age almost.
Right.
Almost there. Last time we went through the war.
Right. And
that was a big subject. You took us through the museum, as a matter of fact,
right.
for that. And now we're taking a look at those post-war years. Significant years as far as Lawrence is concerned?
Oh, definitely. I mean, the Lawrence of...
For the whole nation, for that matter.
They are. And World War II changed things forever, in the sense that, first of all, of course, the U.S. is a dominant world power, and we begin to have more of an international economy. But specifically for Lawrence and Douglas County, the eyes had been opened. The expectations of the retailers, the idea of how great it was to have demand for housing if you had an empty place, and if you wanted to develop housing subdivisions. You know, that all seemed, the horizons had been much different before the war in Lawrence. Growth 500 people every 10 years, and then all of a sudden 3,000 people come in 6 months, and it was a challenge, but it led to an increase in demand for goods and services, and people wanted that to continue after the war.
Wasn't it really a catch-up from the war? I mean, the fact that there were so many things one could not get during the war, and so this was an industrial catch-up.
And you know, the returning veterans are coming back, and they're looking to, how do we fit in? How do we start our families? Maybe they've been delayed, if you will, in the case of 44, 45 months during the war. And there's a lot of that feeling of, I want to get my life back on track, and I want to do it in my hometown. And the Lawrence, after World War II, offers to that generation a chance to be part of a growing community, a rapidly growing community, where they can start a business and have expectations of success and growth and have a prosperous career and stay in their hometown.
And of course there's the GI Bill.
Right.
Which affected a lot, didn't it?
And very
certainly
much
here
so.
in Lawrence with the KU.
Right. It grew up very quickly. Within a matter of a year, enrollment was up by a couple of thousand. By 1946, 47, 47, 48, it's up to 10,000 student enrollment, 6,000 of which were GIs. And so the GIs come, they're an older group, they've been through some, if you will, formative experiences that lead them to be good students, to be concentrating on their education. They change the climate of the university from sort of the 18, 19-year-old carefree environment to family people who are trying to advance their careers, and they bring a seriousness to their studies that, in a sense, help the professors to enjoy the challenge, even though all of a sudden professors who taught maybe 20 were now teaching 100, and they were doing it in a very small campus.
Relatively speaking.
Right, and their resources were being stretched to the limits, and they put up the Memorial Campanile and create Memorial Drive to flank down up from where Memorial Stadium is. And of course, Memorial Stadium and Memorial Union had been for World War I, but Memorial Drive and the Campanile are KU's architectural response to the sacrifice that was done during World War II.
Was there any kind of a letdown, though? I mean, because there was such an emphasis during the war on patriotism and USA and all of that, and, you know, in the global sense. Now that's over, and we've celebrated. We've seen the picture of the sailor kissing the nurse on New York's Broadway, and all of that has concluded now. Is there a letdown, or does it continue to roll as far as the people are concerned?
Well, I don't think not locally, because there was a sense of the opportunity to grow in an expanding community, and I think on the basis of the previous 80 years, when those experiences hadn't been possible, when most of their high school classmates had to leave and go elsewhere to seek opportunity, that Lawrence in Douglas County, because of the growth that occurs here, and you begin to see the hint of the Goodyear plant opens up in Topeka, or a plant opens up in Kansas City, and there are hard surface roads and cars good enough to allow those who can't find jobs in Lawrence, to become commuters, and that's of course an important part of our economy yet today, but that all sort of is in incipient form. So I'd say there was a sense of optimism and confidence locally as opposed to a sort of a letdown.
And you mentioned commuting. When did the interstate come into existence? Is that the 50s?
Eisenhower, yeah, they used national defense as a justification, but the turnpike comes through in 55, 56, and originally the plan was for the turnpike to go 3 miles to the north, just like the railroad had originally going to be going 3 miles to the north, and they moved the turnpike down, and Chancellor Franklin Murphy came in and said, KU needs a west turnpike interchange. Now at that point, Lawrence is a community of about 20,000.
So at this time it only had the east one now?
It would have only had the east unless KU Chancellor had intervened to say that KU needed a second interchange. Well, that second interchange benefited not only the University of Kansas, but one can argue more directly the community of Lawrence. It made possible the relocation of the industries out of the riverfront location out to the Santa Fe Industrial Spur. That's all predicated not only on a railroad connection, but on the West Turnpike interchange.
And it did open up the west.
You bet.
Western part of the town, and where most of KU is, of course.
Right, and in KU, for example, I've been told by Keith Lawton, retired facilities planner at KU, they'd pay 50% of the sewers, the water improvements, the structural improvements that it took to break through the limestone bed that is the case that one often finds in West Lawrence and expand out. So KU, because they knew the campus was going to grow and they'd already been acquiring land far to the south and the west, they helped the city of Lawrence pay for that infrastructure growth.
Now, I recall after the war, of course I was quite young,
right.
But I recall after the war the construction of these tracts of homes, as you mentioned, and they were quite small and just almost I say just coming to the very minimum of a person's need in terms of space requirements and accoutrements and all of that sort of thing. Those houses stuck around for maybe 10 years as being beneficial to these GIs coming home, and then those areas sort of fell.
Right.
And as people began to progress. Did that happen in Lawrence as well? Or?
There is a development on a scale that this town had never seen. There is an area now, and the folks that are going to be watching this out on Oklahoma and Park Hill area, Conrad McGrew, as in the founder of McGrew Real Estate, he developed the Park Hill edition in 1948, 49, and the city, to show you something, made him pay 100% of improvements before the city would connect up water. Today, traditionally with developments, they charge 25%, but the city thought 100 plus pads to develop structures in an organized subdivision. Come on, this is Lawrence. This is a speculative venture. We better have all of our money up front before we allow this to do that. And then after that, you have along close to Sunset Hill School, you have Merle Court, Century, developed by the Century Real Estate Company, whose secretary was Ken Merle out of Topeka, so hence Merle Court. So that was another development of over 100. They'd have a $6,000 plan, an $8,000 plan, and a $10,000 plan, and many of those are still substantial houses and owned by many Lawrence residents today, but they were on a scale in a size that this town, you know, before you'd get a block, maybe 3 or 4 houses, but to have something where you literally have a plan for 100 plus houses, that was a sign of the changing times.
And it did change things.
Yes.
Yeah, and a lot of other things too. So as the industry grew and Lawrence developed, then of course we began to move toward another era, and that is the 50s.
Right.
Out of the 40s, into the 50s, the Beaver Cleaver era, you might say, which many say never existed really. But there was a sort of age of innocence there, wasn't there, in the 50s? And did that affect Lawrence at all? I mean, you know, it was the school hops and you know,
well, the onset of the national media in a major way, and I would say that comes out of what the instrument we're using today, television. I mean, Kansas City television, Topeka television, brings American Bandstand, brings Dick Clark in, and creates sets patterns of drive-ins and gives a sense of what else has happened. I mean, sociologists have said, for example, with race relations, that when Father Knows Best creates this sort of idealized suburban middle-class lifestyle, Native Americans, minorities, blacks who who'd in a sense worked in these houses, but when they see it portrayed on a media, and they see that day in and day out, and they see this idealized form, it creates a set of expectations in parts of town that had never had those expectations before. Because even if they don't have a TV set, somebody in the neighborhood's going to have one, and they're going to see that, and it creates what one sociologist calls an impossible revolution, because it creates a sense of higher expectations about the future. So as much as it's innocence, in a sense, it's creating and manufacturing, if one would say, images of what, quote, success is supposed to be, what family is supposed to be. And most of us, of course, don't identify per se with what we see on the screen, but it still eats at us. It still influences us.
Except, Steve, you know, we did at our house. I mean, we would watch the Cleaver Show.
Right.
We would watch Ozzie and Nelson and what is it, Ozzie and Harriet, sorry.
Right.
And we would come in the living room and say, "Hi, Dad," and it would be, "Hi, Dad," "Hi, Mom," "Hi,
Right,
David,"
right.
"Hi, Ricky."
Oh, sure.
And we'd go through that whole thing. But I think there was a realization that, yeah, it is sort of an age of innocence, but things aren't quite like this.
No, and it's a time in which the automobile is beginning to become, we lose our streetcars, we lose our transportation choices. Amtrak is rapidly becoming Lawrence had into the 50s 25 passenger cars a day, still because they were mandated to carry passenger cars. And here we are with Santa Fe and Union Pacific coming through town, but all of a sudden now we're getting a major transportation choice. Automobiles are becoming available. Gas is 15 cents a gallon.
Right.
And it's creating what would be called the suburban lifestyle, where each person has X amount of square footage around their house, and it's set up on a plan where you don't have alleys anymore. Rather, you have driveways, and you don't have porches anymore. You have areas in the back where you're left by yourself, as opposed to being oriented towards the street, seeing neighbors go by.
Yeah, and you know, it always brings up the question, why do we park on driveways and drive on parkways? But there's a
That's a good one.
But there is a good
Yeah.
one. But there's another thing too. It's the first time in American history, or maybe in world history, where people started walking for exercise instead of to get someplace.
Exactly.
See? That changed it.
Yeah.
We'll be back in a minute, Steve. We're going to come back and talk with Steve about what happened after the 50s, which is really a dramatic time in Lawrence history, much more than maybe many of us realized. Stay tuned. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. Steve Jansen with me as we talk about the history of Lawrence. Steve is the director of the Watkins Museum, as you probably know by now. We've gotten up to the kind of post-war, well, really kind of into the Korean thing, but now that didn't affect Lawrence that much, did it? I mean, it changed some things in terms of industry, but...
Not really, no. What really changes here, in Lawrence in 1960 is about 33,000 people. And that's quite a growth when you think of it having been only 18,000 in 1950. That's a tremendous growth, and that's when you see, as we've talked about, the development of extensive subdivisions. But as we move into the 60s, then again, national media creates expectations. And Martin Luther King Jr.'s work in the 50s in Montgomery leads to a heightened sense, or internal events in Lawrence, coupled with the national events. One is never sure, as a historian anymore, what is totally local and what is, in a sense, inspired by external causes.
And the media is such a big part of that.
Right, and see, that's part of even our explanation for what happened in the 60s is people traditionally said it was caused by outside agitators, as though that explained the problem and transferred the responsibility elsewhere.
Right.
Well, in Lawrence, in 1967, we're voting for the fourth time. 1966, we're voting for the fourth time on a swimming pool. And Lawrence had turned down, well, actually, for the fifth time, we'd turned down the swimming pool 4 times. And that was sort of a litmus test for where whites and blacks would socially interact.
Okay.
So it was, to give you an example, in 1965, there were 35 private pools in the city of Lawrence. I would bet safely that none of those were available to minorities and low-income people. It was another factor of what might be called, as you get larger, there's less and less informal contact, and there's more and more barriers that creep up.
Those early independent schools that started developing during the civil rights movement in the South.
Right.
And many times sort of under the pretense of being something else,
Right.
parochial or otherwise. But we
Now,
know
the
what
Sunflower League, Lawrence High football, I think integrated in 48, 49, but there are still many people alive who remember, that are in their 50s and 60s, who remember being excluded from this process of being able to be a participant. And Lawrence is, in a sense, as it gets larger and you see more and more development of new, then it becomes more and more apparent that there's a separation between these areas that are 5 to 10 years old and these areas that are 50 to 75 years old. And in 1963, over 180 people march on Massachusetts Street saying, "Why is there only one Negro clerk on Massachusetts Street? We want to shop where we work, and we want to be able to eat." And in as late as 1955, 38 restaurants in Lawrence, 33 of them segregated, and 3 of the 5 that didn't were black owned. So this is still a Jim Crow town going into the 60s.
Well, isn't that interesting in light of the history of
Yes,
Kansas, of being a free state,
And here
and particularly with
right, right.
accusations of finger pointing to the South,
Right.
because actually the South wasn't the only place that had the problem, was it?
No, it sure was.
I remember Paul Harvey one day coming on during the 60s
Right.
and saying, you know, he said there was trouble on the south side of Chicago today,
Right.
and that was his way of phrasing that so
Right.
that we'd understand it wasn't just talking about Southern America.
Right, and I think it's important to understand, Bill Moyers came through here in 1970, and he said about listening in a book called Listening to America, and he said he was here when 2 young men were killed on the streets of Lawrence, Rick Dowdell and Nick Rice. And he said, "I once asked a reporter who just returned from 2 years in Vietnam, who's telling the truth over there? He replied, everyone's telling the truth. Everyone over there is witnessing to the truth as they see it, but they all see it differently. So it is with Lawrence. The town is large enough to harbor several communities with their own way of life. It is small enough for every citizen to feel the impact of colliding values. The people I met looked at events through the lens of their own personal experience and defined truth by what they saw. The townspeople who feel threatened, the blacks who feel oppressed, the street people who feel harassed, the students who feel misunderstood, and the police who feel abused. So fiercely had each adherent sworn loyalty to his part of the whole, that the idea of a community, of a place where people exist competitively without malice, would be hard to repair. Some were determined to try. The death of 2 young men and the injuries to others had brought home to Lawrence the words of William Allen White, "Reason has never failed men. Only force and repression have made the wrecks in the world." And I'd like that idea of community as a place where people exist competitively without malice, because we tend to have a romanticized idea that community means everybody's got to get along. Well, let's get real, to use a phrase here. I mean, people aren't always going to get along.
Steve, go back to the deaths of these 2
Right.
young men. What happened here? What was the circumstance?
You're now, we may not know. As a historian, it takes many years for the filters to work, if you will. And the closer we get to contemporary history, the less I become of service to you, because literally there is not as much evidence available yet. The sources haven't all spoken yet.
So were there no convictions on this or anything?
Well, let's just put it this way. I have been told that for months on end, when the Lawrence police went into certain section of our community, they always went in with 2 cars and with plenty of backups, and they expected to get shot at. I mean, there were businessmen who slept in their businesses in Lawrence for months on end to protect their businesses from being firebombed. There was the smell of tear gas in the halls of Lawrence High. There was the smell of tear gas in certain neighborhoods in Lawrence. And it's a very difficult thing. I got here in 1974, and most people in this town who were through that experience still have very strong feelings about it, because they all have a right. That's why I started out with everyone is seeing the truth as they witnessed it. My job as a historian is not to say, well, this is the truth. My job is to help these people tell their truths.
Now all of this chaos surrounded the civil rights movement
Right.
and its effect on Lawrence, or
And the
vice
Vietnam
versa.
War protests.
So
Right.
were they sort of meshed together at this point?
No,
Because
clearly.
ultimately the civil rights movement fades, doesn't it, nationally,
Right.
as the Vietnam crisis becomes the focal point. Like,
And in Lawrence, that's not quite as true. You
Not
have
true.
continuing protests at Lawrence High about black representation into the late 60s on into the 70s. And they did get confused in the popular mind, but they are two different groups in the sense that one group is black generated, black originated, and perceived by the white power structure, if you will, in one way, and then you have these suburban dropout hippies with long hair, but still the feeling that, and they are seen as a danger. There's a book been written about this called Cows Are Freaky When They Look Right at You, an oral history of the Kaw Valley Hemp Pickers Association. That's the name of it, and they describe
all of that?
That's the name. Cows Are Freaky When They Look Right at You, an oral history of the Kaw Valley Hemp Pickers Association. And that is a valuable historical document. It may not be right, but at least it's somebody's version of the truth.
Yeah. So there was a big conflict, and I think you used the term that off air that this became the Berkeley of the Kaw.
It was called Berkeley on the Kaw. 60 Minutes came here and investigated Lawrence, and there was a widespread perception by the parts of those post-World War II generation saying we're being made a disgrace. And ironically, the Watkins Community Museum, which is founded in 1971, is a direct response on the parts of many people in this community to say, well, I don't want people to just think that's what Lawrence is. I want Lawrence's history to be known. I want Lawrence's culture to be known, and not have us portrayed nationally as Berkeley on the Kaw.
And this is where the expression comes to fruition, don't trust anyone over 30. This is what was happening during this time.
Made a lot more sense to me about 20 years ago, but it doesn't make much sense anymore. Yeah, right.
Right, I understand that. So there was a lot of conflict and turmoil, just as we had nationally, of course, and I'm not asking you to assess what happened here, but it did play a part in the total picture in this country to bringing that war to a close.
And it's still reflected on our streets. I mean, Natural Way, it's still reflected in the people that are, the kinds of businesses that exist. Those of us are coming of age that grew up in the 60s. That was for you know, as we were talking before, your major event was World War II. My major event was Kennedy's assassination and the Vietnam War protest. And maybe you'll resent me saying that.
No, we got 30 seconds.
Right.
And I'd have to say my major event was the Korean War.
Okay.
It puts me a little younger.
All right.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
We're about out of time.
I hope so.
But we're going to have you back.
Thank you.
Yeah, because we got to do something from there up until now.
The Lawrence of today.
Now you'll be less help to me, you said, but we'll do something.
Well, I'll work on it.
Okay, Steve. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for coming in, and peace.
Oh, no.